Hello. Warhammer the Old World has recently seen the return of the classic Orcs and Goblins, but this iconic green-skinned faction has one of the longest legacies in the history of Warhammer Fantasy. In this series, I unfurl the ancient documents, consult with the ancestor spirits, and read Old White Dwarves in an attempt to document the history of the greatest Warhammer factions. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're building Warhammer Armies, Orcs and Goblins. Warhammer Fantasy has always had a greenskin infestation, from its very inception when it was a setting-agnostic system that let you just smash together your D&D and Lord of the Ring miniatures, right the way through to it becoming a cohesive, consistent world of geographies, characters, and stories. They've featured on the cover art for Warhammer Fantasy Battle more than pretty much any other faction, and they've been a constant presence in the world of the game. This is my attempt to trace the evolutions and revisions of the Orcs and Goblins army over 40 years of gaming history. But before I get into the grand arc of Orcish history, why not give this video a like, and if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel. This is not the first faction history in this series, nor will it be the last. And if you are planning to buy some of the Old World's Orc and Goblin releases, why not consider using my Element Games affiliate link that you can find in the description below? It really helps support the channel. In Warhammer Fantasy Battles, the Orcs and Goblins have long been a raucous rabble of different goblinoid races that sometimes begrudgingly form alliances and armies in search of battle. The Orcs and Goblins as a faction that most would recognise in Warhammer feature not just Orcs and Goblins, but also snotlings and giants and ogres and trolls, each of which would be worthy topics for their own detailed history, but I'm going to try and touch on it here and there throughout this one. For our purposes today, my focus really is the development of the Orcs and the Goblins themselves, and their central role in the faction that bears their name. Of course, the Orc and the Goblin, though they've been present in Warhammer since the very beginning, did not originate there. They were inspired by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings. Now, I am not a classicist, nor am I a linguist, nor am I a Tolkien scholar, so I'm going to keep this tangent on the origins of orcs as brutish bad guys to a minimum, but I do think it's important enough to warrant dwelling on for at least the length of a gnat's crotchet. Tolkien drew on a number of classical sources, including poems like Beowulf, from which he borrowed the word Orkneus, before shortening it to Orc. What were goblins in The Hobbit became orcs in The Lord of the Rings, the small-statured, scrappy creatures of evil. And they were joined by the Uruk-hai, stronger, meaner orcs that could fight even during the day. These ideas would inform not just the writers of Warhammer, but the sculptors producing fantasy miniatures as well. The early Citadel miniature ranges also included creatures inspired and in some cases licensed from plenty of other worlds and stories. They produced ranges of Ralpatha fantasy miniatures for sale in the UK, which included generic creatures like half-orcs and scimitar-wielding goblins. And there were other Citadel fantasy lines like the Fiend Factory for Dungeons and Dragons creatures and the Fantasy Tribes series, both of which featured variations on classic Tolkien Orcs and Goblins. In the year before Rick Priestley, Richard Halliwell and Brian Ansell would publish Warhammer, Citadel also secured the rights to make RuneQuest miniatures, including Tusk Riders, corrupted troll and human half-breeds that rode great battle pigs, a range that might come in handy for an upcoming battle game. I was also reminded recently by the awesome Andrew May of Meridian Miniatures that Brian Ansell and the Perry twins sculpted a range of red orcs before Warhammer came into being. I should also mention here that several blog posts from the realm of Zhu were really helpful in gathering much of this background information. I've included links to both sources in the description below, along with several other pieces of further reading that are really worth it. When Warhammer was released in 1983, it was with the intention of selling more of these existing Citadel lines. So that's why so many of the forces listed in the game would be either nations of men lifted directly from historical ranges, like medieval knights, or creatures like boar-riding, orky-looking half-trolls, and even literal balrogs. It's no surprise that orcs and goblins would be amongst the many monsters that were imported into the game. But what is perhaps more surprising than the presence of orcs and goblins is the fact that they were green, because Tolkien's were not. In Middle-earth, orcs were mostly dark-skinned, so it seems surprising that from almost the very beginning, Citadel orcs were painted green. Some folks have posited that the earliest goblinoid to be coloured green is actually the Green Goblin of Spider-Man fame, invented by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko in 1964. And then there is the Lord of the Rings art that was created by artist Tim Kirk, who, in the 1970s, was already painting green orcs as well. Dungeons and Dragons, itself drawing plenty of inspiration from Tolkien's work, included orcs that were described in its first edition monster manual as orcs appear particularly disgusting because their coloration, brown or brownish green with a bluish sheen, highlights their pinkish snouts and ears. Their bristly hair is dark brown or black. And then, when Grenadier released miniatures for use in D&D in 1980, the box art for their Orcs Lair figure set featured green-skinned orcs going about their orky business. So it could be that these many different factors caused the early Citadel painting team to choose green for their orc and goblin skin. There have been other suggestions over the years as to why that may have happened though. Some have said that Kev Adams was the first miniature painter to paint any orc green, whilst others have said that for some reason Citadel somehow had an excess of green paint and were looking for an excuse to sell some more, which feels a little bit less likely. Now, I can't take credit for most of that research because it comes from a really fantastic comment on Stack Exchange by Bob Tway, which I've linked in the description below. Unfortunately, it's not conclusive. We don't know for sure why orcs and goblins went from the browny, greyy colours that they were originally described as to the green that we would see in pretty much all media ever since. But whatever the reason, we know that Warhammer's orcs were always green, and despite that, they weren't always Warhammer orcs. One of the earliest scenarios for the Warhammer Mass Battle game came in White Dwarf issue 45, in the form of Joe Dever's Thistlewood, a Warhammer adventure. As was the style at the time, the scenario takes place in a capsule fantasy world, one that sees the King Amias pursuing a thief into the town of Thistlewood, whilst his evil neighbour, the necromantic Lord Versago, attempts to beat the king's forces to recover the stolen relics. The forces of evil that featured in this scenario followed an approach that could be seen in other Warhammer writing for the first few editions. Units and monsters that we would recognise today as undead or warriors of chaos or orcs and goblins would all march to war under the same banner. In this case, there are vile rune orcs, trolls, black sun goblins, and the more traditionally Tolkien, black Uruk. In fact, Joe Dever would go one step further into Tolkien-flavoured Warhammer a few issues later, when, in White Dwarf 53, he wrote a classic scenario for the game, Minas Tirith. Still highly regarded by many Old Hammer aficionados, the Minas Tirith scenario manages to cram a whole lot of game into just 4 pages of magazine. Amongst them are army lists and stats that include Tolkien's Uruk-hai and multiple types of troll. Interestingly enough, the same issue also features an article by Rufus Wedderburn called The Naked Orc, a Study in Orcish Society. This feature wasn't designed for Warhammer though. It was designed to help Dungeons and Dragons players introduce more variety into their games when using the already ubiquitous monster, the orc. That first edition of Warhammer was designed to allow players to use their RPG miniatures en masse to fight big-scale battles using whatever miniatures they already had to hand. And it was also designed to encourage them to buy more. It wasn't a formal strategy battle game in quite the way we would recognise it today, but it did include many of the fantasy races that would become stalwarts of the genre. The bestiary section of the first edition included a variety of goblins, as well as their monstrous relatives, the orcs, and the stupid, ferocious, and unhygienic trolls. The major supplement for that first edition of the game was Forces of Fantasy, which provided something a little bit closer to standardized army lists, though it was still pretty loose by modern standards. It also included an early Warhammer definition of the term goblinoid. A goblinoid is a creature of general goblin stock, and here I would include all goblins, hobgoblins, and orcs, as well as crossbreeds. It should come as no surprise that orcs and goblins proliferated very, very quickly, and it didn't take long for there to be many different types of greenskin waging war across the as yet unnamed Warhammer world. The several Forces of Fantasy pages devoted to goblins expanded on the key details found in the first edition rules, many of which would go on to remain in place throughout Warhammer history. Just like their Tolkien ancestors, goblins hated dwarves, and they often find themselves squabbling amongst each other. Present from almost day one were the rules for inter-goblinoid animosity, which can see greenskin units lose control and fight other regiments in their own army, or even turn on themselves. And, as is often the case, there were already way more goblins than there were orcs. The section on goblins detailed 4 different types of these diminutive blighters. Great goblins, the largest and toughest of the goblins, stand at the top of goblin society, sometimes riding boars into combat. Lesser goblins are smaller than their great brethren, and often find themselves subservient to the bigger boys. The red goblins were given Middle-earth flavour, described as a tribe of goblins that were by far the most evil of their kind, and which had been created by the work of necromantic wizards. And more common in number than any other goblinoid were the night goblins, already donning their famed robes and conical capriote-style hats. And hidden amongst them from the very beginning were night goblin fanatics. These wonderfully, whimsically absurd goblins, swinging a metal ball and chain around their own heads, were conceived by the Perry twins and worked into the game by Rick Priestley, who enjoyed the absurdity of the creation. An early sign of how Warhammer would continue to draw on humour and goofiness to magnificent effect for many years to come. There were also statistics and an overview provided for hobgoblins, large aggressive relatives of regular goblins that none of the other goblinoids actually seemed to like, but who were nevertheless useful, as they made most of the weapons and armour that their cousins wore into battle, and when they joined the fight, they would do so with their mutant guard dogs, the hobhounds. And of course, there were orcs as well. Mention is made of the long-lost pig-faced orcs, a fun reference that puts a tiny bit of distance between early Warhammer and its D&D inspirations. But the regular orcs that survived in Warhammer seem pretty similar to their more modern descendants. They're described as tougher and meaner than goblins, and despite their close relations, they are just as likely to fight and kill each other. At this time, mounted orcs were riding wolves into battle, but that wouldn't always be the case. And there is already a link established between the mightiest orcs and their infamous flying beasts, the wyverns. The Citadel Miniatures range already included a wide variety of orcs and goblins to support the rules found in Forces of Fantasy. Ali Morrison's half-orcs, goblins sculpted by the brothers Perry, and troll ranges produced by all 3 sculptors together. But it would be impossible to imagine modern orcs and goblins from Games Workshop without the incredible work of Kev Adams, the legendary Goblin Master. Kev Adams sculpted an extensive range of goblins, orcs, and their war machines over the course of many years. Everything from Araboys to goblin battle chariots, from orcs to orcs to orcs. Many orcs felt somewhat wiry and snarling up to this point, but in no small part thanks to Adams, the Citadel orc became broader, more heavily set, and with a menacing playfulness that would help imbue the greenskins with humour and character like never before. A legendary range of miniatures for one of the most recognisable factions in Warhammer. During the early editions of Warhammer, much of the world building and storytelling was happening through regiments of renown. These were unique units led by characters with their own backstories and names and bits of history, and they often introduced new concepts that would go on to take root in what would become the Warhammer world. Grom's Goblin Guard were made up of the dregs of Goblin society, and were led by Grom, a particularly fat goblin known as the Paunch of Misty Mountain. Apparently, it was Grom who initiated the Goblin Wars with the dwarves, when he slew Wulfrun Willowhand, king of the Northern Dwarves, in a drunken brawl. The cause of the dispute is not recorded, although the relative merits of Old Sam's Brown and Bugman's Best may have been responsible. Which is a bit of lore that I love, because it suggests that there was a time in Warhammer history when goblins and dwarves were sat in the same tavern, drinking the same beer, and arguing about which one was best. Just fun. Grom was slain whilst assaulting the dwarf fortress of the Middenheim, marking the first appearance of the city of Middenheim in Warhammer lore, though of course here it belonged to the dwarves and not the Empire. Later regiments of renown would include Harboth and the Black Mountain Boys, whose background would include the first mention of Blackfire Pass. Harboth himself would later return with a regiment of archers as well. And then there were Goldfag's mercenary ogres, and Ruglud's armoured orcs, and the despoiling hobgoblins of the Darklands. And there were also Iza Ujazod's Mother Crushers, the first appearance of Black Orcs in the Warhammer world. In the mid-1980s, sculptor Nick Lund joined Citadel when his company Chronicle Miniatures was acquired by Brian Ansell. Amongst the ranges that were transferred and subsequently produced by Citadel were Lund's Black Orcs, representing the toughest and fiercest examples of orc warriors. Lund then set to work crafting Iza Ujzod and his unit of equally ferocious mercenaries. There was also some more lore being added to the Warhammer world at this time through the use of campaign packs, though not a lot of it would stay in the Warhammer world for all that long. Both the Tragedy of Macbeth, which features Dwarven civil war in Albion, and Bloodbath at Orcs Drift would feature campaigns built around the presence of the greenskins. The stories from these campaign packs wasn't really built on in subsequent editions, but we did get to see the beginning of a sense of orc and goblin armies in a more traditional sense, and that was just the tip of the iceberg for new armies of orcs and goblins that would soon be mustering in the emerging Warhammer world. For much of Warhammer's early life, there wasn't as formal a system for building army lists and having these distinct factions. Sure, there was Forces of Fantasy, and after that came Ravening Hordes, which gave you army lists built around specifically orcs and goblins, but there was also more of a sense of just good versus evil, and you could see that in other games that were being produced by Games Workshop around this time. In fact, many of the releases during the first editions of Warhammer would see orcs and their goblinoid chums teaming up with the forces of chaos or just evil in general. The 1987 game Chaos Marauders by Stephen Hand sees players acting as orc warlords, assembling their forces under the banner of chaos. And in the game, there's plenty of great John Blanche illustrated orcs and goblins, but there's also Skaven and Beastmen and even Chaos Warriors that you can bring into your horde. Similarly, the forces of evil featured in the Games Workshop collaborations with MB Games in the late 80s and early 90s would feature orcs and goblins in league with other forces of darkness. In HeroQuest, the evil wizard Morkar, or Zargon in certain corners of the known world, would happily challenge heroes with green plastic green skins alongside enemies of other hues and histories. And in Battlemasters, the Chaos Lord led an army of orcs and goblin wolf riders with ogres and other units that we would recognise as chaos in the modern game. Both of these board games are ostensibly set in the world of Warhammer, but do feel free to prove or disprove that claim in the comments below. Even the cover of Warhammer's 3rd edition would support this melange of good versus evil, with a maelstrom of battle featured on its cover that has bits of everything. Humans, elves, and dwarves take on chaos warriors and chaos sorcerers, mutant two-headed goblins, and plenty of other greenskins besides. There's even a cheeky fanatic hidden in the background. And yet, within its pages, there would be evidence of the growing shift towards the Warhammer world and its distinct armies being clearly defined, consistent, and organised. Well, as organised as a goblinoid rabble can get. Ravening Hordes had included more details on half-orcs, and it also introduced savage orcs into the mix as well. Orcs even more brutish and violent in their nature, who rejected modern technology like swords and armour. They even believed that their nakedness would magically protect them from enemy strikes. By this point, goblins could now ride wolves and boars, whilst orcs were still riding wyverns, and there was a more direct connection established between trolls and the forces of the goblinoids. And I mustn't forget a tiny addition: snotlings. It was, of course, famed goblin master Kev Adams who reportedly invented the snotlings, much as he would later invent the squigs for 40k, following Brian Ansell's requests for some appropriately goblinoidian little monsters. Snotlings would join battle on bases of 9, and in some cases might be equipped with puffballs, template-based poisonous fungus that the snotlings could throw at living enemies. The snotlings had also developed war machinery as well, riding into battle on the deadly pump wagon. The orcs would play a key role in the development of Citadel plastic, with experiments in the material resulting in drastic plastic orcs in 1986. They were not the first plastic Citadel miniatures, and by all accounts they are a bit rough going, but they were an impressive evolution at the time, and an important stepping stone to what would come later. Plus, the advert for these chaps features the term "Wah, the Orcs," which is noteworthy because I am struggling to identify the earliest reference to Wah in the game and the lore. This advert is dated ahead of the 1990 40k book, Wah, the Orcs, but the term could very well have appeared even earlier. I do not know what the actual origin of the term Wah is. So, if you know, I would love to hear it. Please let me know, because I've been trying to find it out, and without reading every single bit of material from all Games Workshop history, I can't find it. I'm having sleepless nights over here, please. You can also find plastic orcs and goblins in the Warhammer Fantasy Regiments box that was released the following year. This set included 60 plastic miniatures, 10 each of Skaven, Elf, Dark Elf, Dwarf, Orc, and Goblin. And it seems like these sprues represented a significant advancement over the drastic plastic orcs and the psychostyrene dwarves that came before them. And with the new edition of the game, things became refined even further. The 3rd edition core book continued to enshrine the Ravening Horde's view of the forces of the goblinoids into the fabric of the game. Hobgoblins were now described as being largely located in the open steppe land east of the World Edge Mountains and north of the Darklands, whilst the still present half-orcs would roam the old world as dangerous robber bands. Meanwhile, the orcs' main strongholds are described as being in the Darklands and the surrounding mountains, although they still thrive deep in the forests of the old world itself. Much as there would be in the soon-to-be-released Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness book, there was mention made of Chaos Goblins as well. The race of goblins has proven especially vulnerable to the mutating effects of the incursions of chaos. As in human society, mutants may be driven out from their tribes so that they are forced to band together with other chaotic forces to ravage the northern wastes, the borders of Kislev, and even parts of the old world. The geography and history of the Warhammer world was truly becoming something more coherent, thanks to the release of the 3rd edition of the game and the arrival of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. All of those little snippets of background that had been featured in Regiments of Renown and here and there in Citadel journals and compendiums started to be put into a similar, consistent world with its own timeline and calendar of events. The Goblin Wars, in which the holds of the dwarves were fractured and in some cases lost, were now a more detailed feature of the timeline, as was the eventual expulsion of greenskins from the old world itself by an alliance of dwarf and man. Goblins are common in the underground fortresses of the World's Edge Mountains and the Darklands beyond. In the old world, they are securely established in the deeper recesses of the forests and mountains, areas traditionally shunned by humans and only nominally part of the human kingdoms. The lesser goblins of earlier editions are still referenced, but they no longer have their own stat lines like they did in 2nd edition, and there is no mention at all of night, forest, or red goblins as distinct type of goblinoid creatures. In fact, the latter of these, the red goblins, would never be heard of again. Goblin units could be led by champions of any goblinoid race, though there is a frankly cruel exception that excludes snotlings. And although the goblin entry in the core book had been simplified somewhat from previous editions, the orc section, by comparison, had been stripped back to the bone. But it wouldn't stay that way for very long. The Citadel Journal for spring 1987 had presented miniature ranges for savage orcs, orc boar riders, orc warriors and orc champions, and even orc villagers. Further adverts for these minis were seen in White Dwarf, and with the Warhammer Armies book that was released in 1988, many of these miniatures would be given brand new rules. The Black Orcs became a regular regiment rather than just one of renown. The Savage Orcs appeared, as did the War Boar mount for orcs in units called Snorters and Grunters. There were also mobs of Orc Biggins available, bigger, tougher, and more fearsome than regular orcs, but presumably smaller, more fragile, and less fearsome than Black Orcs. Gobbo Wolf Boys were present, Scabby Half Orcs were somehow still in the edition, and Trolls were there as well, with plenty of other options made available. Plus, you could take Giants as mercenaries. The photo feature for the Orcs and Goblins lists was the army of Goblin Master Kev Adams, and what a tremendous army it is. A classic horde marshalled by one of the greatest goblin wranglers in Games Workshop history. Just a quick note here, because I couldn't find anywhere more comfortable to place it, on Orc and Goblin war machines. Over the editions, there have been a huge number of greenskin artillery and war machines released. Skull Crushers, Lead Belchers, Spear Chuckers, Pump Wagons, Bolt Throwers, Man Manglers, Wolf Chariots, Boar Chariots, and, if you can really call it a war machine, Goblin Doom Divers. I have no particular point to make about these war machines other than to say that they're all pretty great. Especially Goblin Doom Divers, great bunch of lads. In the pages of White Dwarf, you can find many incredible examples of Orc and Goblin armies from this time period. It would take an entire video to do them justice, so I'm just going to put some really cool stuff on screen and keep talking for a minute. For instance, there's this White Dwarf 88. For instance, in White Dwarf issue 88, you would find Richard Halliwell and Rick Priestley's army list for the Crooked Conquerors, a force made up of goblins from the Broken Nose tribe. And White Dwarf didn't just feature cool heavy metal and articles, it also had some very good battle reports featuring the Orcs and Goblins as well, including a couple of favourites. White Dwarf 91 featured a relatively early example of a solely Orc and Goblin force marching under the banner of Gruzuk Blood Gobbler in the scenario Blood on the Snow. Sadly, I don't think Gruzk or his goblin commander, Bogrot Snotbrum, were ever seen again in Warhammer lore, though I'd be happy to be proved wrong. In issue 120, the Wood Elves took on the might of the Greenskin Horde in the Gathering of Eagles, a battle report based on a Gamesday 1989 game. And what's more, this battle report was accompanied by some absolutely gorgeous Gary Chalk artwork. And then, in White Dwarf 157, a legend would be born at the Battle of Osterwald, as the Orc and Goblin army was led by a new character leader, Azag the Slaughterer. Using the Orc Shaman on War Wyvern model from Marauder, this battle report would create an enduring special character, one of the most dangerous Orc warlords of recent memory, empowered by the Crown of Sorcery and leaving a trail of destruction across the Empire. Of course, Jervis Johnson was working on a spectacular battle report losing streak at the time, so Azag didn't really cover himself in glory in this particular battle. With the 4th edition of Warhammer just around the corner, things would change significantly, and the Orcs and Goblins themselves would become a significant bellwether for that evolution. The 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy was designed to be lighter, brighter, and more accessible to younger players, and to assist with that, it launched with the first complete starter box in the game's history. It included everything you needed to play, from rules to dice, and it featured 2 iconic armies in brand new Citadel plastic, High Elves and Goblins. For the full history of the 4th edition, you can check out my video on it right here, but not until you've finish the rest of this one. One thing of note was that over the course of 4th edition, every faction would receive monopose plastic core troops in classic boxes, and the Orcs and Goblins were no different. They received mixed sets of Orc warriors and archers, alongside the Goblins repackaged from the core box, and plastic Black Orcs who were very eager for everyone to see their axes. To celebrate the launch of the new edition, White Dwarf 153 included a feature dedicated to a returning favourite, the Night Goblins. The article showed off new lore and showcased the latest models in the range. As well as the new plastic Goblin infantry, there would be updated Fanatics and Night Goblin command models, as well as special weapon-wielding foot troops too. The first Warhammer Armies book dedicated to the Orcs and Goblins was released in 1993. And it further codified the army lists that were featured in the Battle Bestiary of Warhammer 4th Edition's core box. This would be the book that helped to solidify the army of Orcs and Goblins into its form that would more or less remain the same for the rest of the game's life. As well as the return of the Night Goblins, the Forest Goblins were restored to the lineup too, even getting some new mounts of their own. Big, creepy spiders. Great news. I'm sure they'll never leave us again. Plus, Trolls took on their new stone and river flavours. Both different, both gross. And the Orc and Goblin Shamans got access to dedicated War magic with the release of the 4th edition Battle Magic set. It was finally time to crush your enemies with the foot of Gork, or possibly Mork. And it was with this armies book that the Goblinoids received their coolest addition yet, the Squig. Kev Adams designed the original Squigs for inclusion in the Tyrannid forces of 40k, and they were unusual. But then Orc runt herds apparently captured some of these critters, and they became more closely associated with Space Orcs. For Warhammer Fantasy, the range was updated, again by Adams, and they became the famous round boys of modern GW. And not just that, but some Night Goblins would actually hop on them into battle. This was also where we would find the Goblin Doomdivers, which are memorable for me, because at the Screaming Death Roadshow, I had to pretend to be one in order to secure my prize of a Screaming Death t-shirt. Worth it. The 4th edition Armies book included special characters, and some of the Orc and Goblin names were old friends. Azag the Slaughterer now had special rules, and Grom of the Misty Mountain returned from the dead, paunch and all. A particular favourite of mine has long been the Night Goblin Warlord of the 8 Peaks, Skarsnik, and his squig called Gobbler. And also of note was that this was where Hobgoblins had completely decoupled from the rest of the greenskin horde. Instead, they became a feature of the sometime Warhammer faction, the Chaos Dwarves, from here on out. There was no updated armies book for the 5th edition of the game, but there would be a new campaign pack that featured the Goblinoids, the Idol of Gork. Like their 2nd edition forebears, the 5th edition campaign packs all included cardboard buildings for use with the scenarios in the set, and the Idol of Gork was a good one. You got an Orc village, as well as the titular desecrated idol. Those early Orc villager miniatures would finally have somewhere to call home. With the 6th edition of the game came a new starter box, one that featured an Orc army. And just a short 7 years since the last one, there was a new Orc and Goblins army book. This was the edition that updated many plastic troops to be multi-part kits, and there would be some major refreshes for the rest of the range as well, from a huge team of sculptors who I've put on screen because they are all awesome. New versions of the Boar Boys and the Wolf Riders, Savage Orcs, Orc Boys, and Orc War Machines would all be released in this edition. One of the few losses from the army was, you guessed it, the Forest Goblins. These were now treated like any other gobbo mob, whilst the Spider Riders were dropped from the main army completely. There would be a couple of new characters to balance things out with this edition though, one of whom would be incredibly important to the very fate of the Warhammer world. For this edition, at least. The Black Orc war boss Grimgor Ironhide, sculpted by Brian Nelson, was described as the epitome of orkiness, the hardest orc alive, and a terror in combat. Sounds like one of my cats. Of course, Grimgor would give Archaon the headache of his life in the Storm of Chaos event, and would go on to remain a thorn in the side of everyone until the very end of Warhammer's known world. Over the course of the edition, there would also be some fun concepts that were less world-ending and just more world-enriching. There were new goblins published in White Dwarf and the Chronicles series, Troglagobs, Fire Kobolds, Hill Goblins, and even necromantically risen Dust Goblins that have a hint of that classic Red Goblin magic baked in. With the 7th edition, there would be some major changes to the metaphysical nature of greenskins in the Warhammer world. They weren't from the Warhammer world at all. At some point, the orcs arrived. Quite probably their insidious spores were unwittingly introduced to the world by the star vessels of the Old Ones. Although possibly, they drifted through the void of space and came to the world by their own means. Either way, in the hidden wilderness, the greenskins spread to become a constant thorn in the side of the other races. The likely origin of this unlikely origin is Gorka Morka. Released in 1997, Gorka Morka presented an isolated orc-infested planet of constant Mad Maxian road wars, and because it needed a narratively infinite supply of orcs, it seems that some inspiration was taken from the relationship between orcs and fungus, mentioned in earlier orc books for 40k, but it was given a significant twist to make them not just fungus eaters, but actual fungus beers. With the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40,000 in 1998, this idea was codified into the wider 40k lore, and by the 7th edition of Warhammer Fantasy, it was adopted there as well. Of course, this little bit of flavourful cross-pollination between 40k and Warhammer Fantasy makes little impact on the battlefield. It's just interesting to note, I suppose. But what does make a big change on the battlefield is the completely refreshed range of orcs and goblins that was available for Warhammer's 7th edition. Key changes to the 7th edition army included new plastic regiments for most of the core mobs, and a major glow-up for characters like Skarsnik and Gobbler. There were also a couple of characterful but random models that were released as well, including a Night Goblin in a squig chase, and this truly wonderful Orc Raider with a pig. Honestly, I think that this Raider with a pig model is just really, really beautiful. We were talking about it in my Discord. I can't get enough of it. If they re-release this for the old world, is very real possibility that I'll be starting a war. In the 8th and final edition of Warhammer Fantasy, the army list for Orcs and Goblins didn't really change all that much at all, nor did the range of miniatures that was available. There wasn't really much new stuff or many changes at all, to be honest. Even in the end times when other armies were getting enormous units and all kinds of wild stuff, the Orcs and Goblins didn't seem to get an awful lot. But this was a time when new technologies and the will of the creatives at Games Workshop seemed to be skewing towards bigger and bigger stuff. So there were a couple of things that came out for the Orcs in this edition that were bigger. The in and out Forest Goblin Spider Riders were back once and for all, and this time they were massive. But, thankfully, there were a couple of Savage Orcs who had the means to keep those giant spiders in line. with their big stabber. Oh, and there were some nasty skulking goblins who went the opposite way, shrinking into the shadows. But that was mostly it for new stuff in this edition. Though, it was also in this era that the Warhammer Forge was producing some chunky new models as well, including, I think, one of the best monsters to ever join a war, the Rogue Idol. Okay, apologies for stopping as if I've hit a stone wall, but this video is way longer than I originally intended it to be, so we're going to call it there. I hope that you've enjoyed this run through some of the evolutions of the Orcs and Goblins. I have almost certainly missed very important stuff. Please feel free to let me know in the comments what I didn't cover that was important, whether that was new miniatures or changes to rules or different releases. I would also love to hear what your favourite ever Orc and Goblin miniature has been from any edition. I think there's loads of great examples. I would love if you could share those with me, so jump in the comments below. If you want to support the work I do here on the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon, my Ko-fi, and my Discord. All of the links are in the description below, and you can also support me by using my Element Games affiliate link next time you go and buy your hobby supplies. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. Like, I think the War is related to the kind of 40k football hooligan version of Orcs, but I just don't know for sure, and I would love to know, and I need to find out.